Victoria is 227,000 square kilometres of self-satisfaction. Everyone thinks they've done it. The Great Ocean Road, the Penguins, a weekend in the Yarra Valley pretending they can taste the oak. They go home telling people they've seen Victoria, which is roughly like reading the back cover of a book and saying you finished it. Because tucked inside this state, there are places so strange that even locals born and raised here have never heard of them. A town under a lake. A hill where cars roll the wrong way. A fossilised footprint from the first animal that ever walked on land. An abandoned timber mega hotel the size of a small suburb just sitting there. 12 of them ranked, and the weirdest is last. Let's go. Number 12, the Cape Otway Radar Bunker. Let's begin with something you've probably driven past without noticing. If you've done the Great Ocean Road, you've been to Cape Otway, you've paid the entry fee, you've walked up to the lighthouse, and you've thought, well, that's the lighthouse. A short walk from the lighthouse dug into the headland, there's a concrete bunker that most visitors walk straight past without giving it a second look. It is the Radar Operations Building of Number 13 Radar Station, one of the first operational radar installations on the Australian mainland and the very first in Victoria, built in 1942. The walls are concrete, roughly 35 centimetres thick. The interior is divided into 3 rooms, a wireless telegraphy room, a radar room, and a room for the operator, who sat in near total darkness, staring at an early war British radar screen known to the crew as a Duva. This small reinforced room was one of 4 radar stations ringing Bass Strait. The others were at Wilson's Promontory, Metung, and Garbo Island, and its job was to see in advance anything coming towards Melbourne by sea or air. German U-boats were known to prowl these waters. Japanese submarines were confirmed to have launched a reconnaissance aircraft over Melbourne from off the coast of King Island in 1942, using the Cape Otway Lighthouse itself as a navigational landmark on the way in. The radar station went live shortly after, and it was classified. The people who worked in that bunker, including women of the Women's Auxiliary Australian Air Force, signed secrecy agreements. Many of them did not talk about what they had done for decades. You can walk inside. Parks Victoria and a group of surviving radar veterans restored the interior with the original style wireless equipment in place. Stand in the main room, listen to the Southern Ocean grinding away at the cliffs outside, and it suddenly becomes very easy to imagine a 19-year-old from Ballarat sitting there at 3 in the morning, watching a green blip move across a screen, wondering if it was a whale or the beginning of the war actually arriving. Most tourists walk past it without looking twice. They're there for the lighthouse. The lighthouse is fine. The bunker is the real story. Number 11, the town at the bottom of Lake Eildon. Now let's do something completely different, because if we keep doing concrete bunkers, you'll click away. Let's go underwater. Lake Eildon is a huge artificial lake about 2.5 hours from Melbourne, and in summer it fills up with houseboats. It is the only body of water in Victoria where houseboats are permitted, and roughly 750 of them drift around the lake at any given time, barbecuing and wakeboarding and generally behaving like houseboats do. What almost nobody on those houseboats realises is that they are floating directly over a town. Darlingford was a real, functioning gold rush town established in the 1860s. At its peak, it had 7 hotels, a log jail, 5 policemen, a post office, a school, and a small but determined population of miners working the Big River goldfields. In 1915, the Victorian government began building a reservoir called the Sugarloaf Dam to supply water to the Goulburn Valley. By 1929, the dam was complete and Darlingford was completely underwater. When the much larger Eildon Dam replaced it in 1956, the flooding was final. Residents were relocated. The Darlingford Hotel, the general store, the houses, the roads, the school. All of it was left in place and submerged. During extreme drought, the lake drops low enough that parts of the old town briefly emerge again. In the early 2000s, when Lake Eildon fell to around 5% of capacity, the tops of some original buildings reportedly broke the surface. Then the rain came, and everything went back under. There is something genuinely haunting about this. Not a legend, not a folk story. A documented 19th century town with descendants of residents still alive, sitting quietly at the bottom of a lake while tourists on the surface cook sausages and argue about water skiing technique, entirely unaware that 5 metres below their barbecue is the front step of somebody's grandmother's cottage. Number 10, the staircase of Mammoth Bluestone on the Maribyrnong, about 5 kilometres from the Melbourne CBD, tucked between Flemington Racecourse and High Point Shopping Centre, behind earth-covered bluff mounds on the banks of the Maribyrnong River, is a 19th century fortress of bluestone that almost no Melburnian has ever set foot inside. It is called Jack's Magazine, and it is absolutely enormous. The complex was designed by the government architect William Wardle and built between 1875 and 1878 to do one specific job: store the colony of Victoria's gunpowder, specifically to store the massive quantities of imported explosives needed to fuel the gold mining industry, which at its peak was moving, blasting, and refining more rock per year than almost any other operation on Earth. The site covers 12 hectares. It contains 2 enormous vaulted bluestone magazine buildings, a perimeter bluestone wall, earth blast mounds, tunnels, tramways, a canal connecting it to the river, and a loading dock. The buildings are hidden behind the earth mounds because if any of the gunpowder ever went up, the designers wanted the blast to be directed upward, not sideways into the surrounding district. The trolleys running on the tramway were pushed by men, not horses, because a horse panicking with a trolley full of gunpowder was considered an unacceptable risk, whereas a man could, in theory, jump out of the way. Melbourne really was a different place in the 1870s. It kept operating through 2 world wars, through Federation, through the decline of gold mining, through the rise of Footscray as a munitions manufacturing suburb, until it was decommissioned in the early 1990s. Since then, it has been locked up and largely empty, managed now by a heritage organisation that opens it for guided tours on the first Sunday of each month. And here's the strange part. It is 5 kilometres from the CBD. You can see it from the High Point car park, more or less. A vast bluestone explosives storage supersite from colonial Victoria in the middle of suburban Melbourne, and most people who live in the neighbourhood have no idea it's there. Number 9, the hill where cars roll uphill. Drive 77 kilometres north of Melbourne. Head past Hanging Rock, yes, that Hanging Rock, and find a quiet country road called Straws Lane in Woodden. Park at the bottom of what appears to be a gentle uphill slope. Put your car in neutral. Take the handbrake off, your car will start rolling uphill, not fast, not dramatically. Just a slow, silent, absolutely not supposed to happen drift in the wrong direction. You can do it with a ball. You can do it with a sort of water bottle. You can pour water onto the road and watch it flow upslope, defying gravity and several hundred years of established physics. This is Anti-Gravity Hill, and it is one of only 4 officially documented gravity hills in Australia. It is not signposted. The locals have traditionally refused to tell tourists exactly where it is, partly out of genuine pride and partly because the road is narrow and has farm traffic on it. The site sits somewhere along Straws Lane near the intersection with Romsey Road. And if you drive the length of the lane with your windows down, you'll know when you found it because every second car is stopped with confused people hanging out of the windows holding tennis balls. The underlying explanation is a very good optical illusion. The surrounding landscape, a combination of slanting horizon lines, uneven hills on either side, and no reliable visual reference points, tricks the brain into reading a slight downhill slope as uphill. A spirit level on the road surface shows the truth. Your eyes refuse to believe it. The experience of sitting in a car that is clearly, obviously, visibly rolling up a hill is so disorienting that you end up laughing out loud because your brain simply cannot process what it's seeing. Hanging Rock is an hour's drive from Melbourne. Every year, thousands of people visit to experience its famous atmospheric strangeness. Almost none of them know that 20 minutes down the road, there is a piece of countryside that breaks the laws of physics as far as your brain is concerned, and you can prove it with a tennis ball. Number 8, the Catalina in the Cornfield, 290 kilometres north of Melbourne. On the shore of a pretty little lake in the Murray region, you will find the only inland flying boat repair base that ever operated in Australia. In 1942, after Japanese aircraft attacked Darwin and Broome and destroyed 16 Allied flying boats on the water, the RAAF had a sudden, urgent problem. Flying boats, massive long-range amphibious aircraft used for reconnaissance, patrol, and supply runs across the Pacific, needed a secure repair facility somewhere well away from the coast, somewhere no Japanese aircraft could realistically reach, somewhere with a body of open water big enough to land a PBY Catalina on. They chose Lake Boga. Lake Boga is roughly 5 kilometres long, flat, and in 1942 it was surrounded by wheat fields, sheep paddocks, and almost nothing else. The RAAF moved in, set up number 1 flying boat repair and service depot, built concrete slipways, hangars, a semi-underground communications bunker, and for the next 5 years, they quietly patched up Catalinas, Sunderlands, Mariners, Kingfishers, and Walrus amphibians, aircraft of the Royal Australian, United States, Royal Dutch, and British Air Forces in the middle of the Victorian outback. At its peak, the base serviced over 400 flying boats. The existence of the depot was one of the best-kept secrets in wartime Australia, mainly because the thought of a flying boat landing on a wheatbelt lake sounds too absurd to be real. The locals saw them constantly and kept their mouths shut, which, for a small country town, is a genuinely impressive feat of national security discipline. The base was shut down in 1947. Everything was sold off or dismantled, but the communications bunker remained, sunk into the ground beside the lake, forgotten until the Lake Boga Lions Club decided in the 1980s to turn it into a museum. Today, a fully restored Catalina PBY-5 flying boat, serial number A24-30, sits inside a modern hangar on the shore, and you can walk inside its fuselage. You can descend into the original concrete bunker, reconstructed from wartime plans, and you can stand on the slipway looking out over the flat, unspectacular surface of Lake Boga and try to picture a 30-metre aircraft coming in to land in a wheatbelt paddock. It happened over and over, and hardly anybody knows. Number 7. The abandoned Grand Hotel at 1,400 metres, on a plateau high above the town of Bright. Roughly 3 hours' drive northeast of Melbourne sits the largest timber building in Australia. It is 3 stories tall in some sections. It contains dozens of bedrooms, a grand dining hall, a ballroom, offices, lounges, and a soda fountain installed the year it opened. It is structurally enormous, architecturally distinctive, heritage listed, and it has been locked up and empty since 2007. This is the Mount Buffalo Chalet. It was built in 1910 by the Victorian Public Works Department, originally as a ski lodge, Australia's first serious alpine resort. The original plans were for a granite building, but the budget collapsed, and the architect George Austin was forced to improvise with a timber frame on a granite base. What he produced was one of the most distinctive heritage buildings in the Australian Alps, a rambling, eccentric timber mega hotel perched 1,400 metres above sea level, with views over the Ovens Valley that still stop people in their tracks. For 80 years, it was a functioning resort. The Victorian Railways took it over in 1924 and ran the dining room with the same crockery and silverware they used in their dining cars. Every teapot and soup bowl stamped with the Viffy R monogram. Generations of Victorians honeymooned there, skied there, got engaged on its verandas and celebrated anniversaries in its dining hall. Then, in 2007, the last private lessee handed the keys back to the state and the chalet closed. It has not reopened. Parks Victoria has poured millions into external restoration, new roof, re-stumping, weatherboard replacement, but the interior is frozen in time. Some of the rooms are still made up with bedding from the day the last guest checked out. You can walk up to the building, press your face against the windows, and see original Victorian Railways furniture, tableware, ornaments, and soda fountain equipment sitting exactly where it was in the 1990s. On Australia Day, families still drive up to picnic on its terraced gardens, looking at the largest timber building in the country and wondering reasonably why nobody has managed to reopen it in nearly 2 decades. The silence is the strange part. This should be one of the most famous buildings in Australia. It's almost unknown. Number 6, the 6,000-year-old engineering project. In southwestern Victoria, on the traditional country of the Gunditjmara people, there is an engineering project that predates the Egyptian pyramids, predates Stonehenge, predates almost every other piece of large-scale human infrastructure still recognisable on Earth. It is called Budge Bim, and the scale of it is genuinely difficult to accept. Around 30,000 years ago, a volcano at the southern end of the Great Dividing Range erupted and sent lava flowing across a wide landscape. The lava cooled into extensive basalt flows, creating a network of natural channels and depressions across roughly 100 square kilometres of country. The Gunditjmara did not find this landscape useful and leave it alone. They redesigned it. Using the abundant volcanic stone, the Gunditjmara built a vast, deliberately engineered system of channels, weirs, ponds and traps to farm kuyang, short-finned eels, on an industrial scale. The oldest parts of this system have been radiocarbon dated to at least 6,600 years old, making it one of the oldest stone-walled fish traps anywhere in the world. Some scholars argue that the system has been continuously modified and used for even longer. By manipulating water flow across the lava field, the Gunditjmara created artificial ponds at different depths, trapping eels at different stages of their life cycle, storing them alive, smoking them in the hollows of old trees for preservation, and running what was effectively a year-round aquaculture industry capable of feeding up to 10,000 people and supporting a trade network that extended across much of southeastern Australia. This directly contradicts the nomadic hunter-gatherer framing that dominated non-Indigenous Australian education for most of the 20th century. The Gunditjmara built permanent stone house foundations called woons near their ponds and lived in semi-permanent villages on a productive, engineered landscape, using sophisticated hydrological knowledge for thousands of years before anything comparable existed in most of Europe. In 2019, Budge Bim became Australia's first site inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List purely for its Indigenous cultural values. It is accessible to visitors via Gunditjmara-led tours through Budge Bim National Park, about a 4-hour drive from Melbourne. The infrastructure is there, the stone channels are there, the weirs and traps are there, still working if the water is let back through, and most Victorians have no idea that one of the oldest aquaculture systems on Earth is a day trip from their house. Number 5. The Pink Granite Lighthouse on the island nobody visits. At the far eastern edge of Victoria, about 500 metres off the coast near Malakuta, there is an island. It is 154 hectares, shaped roughly like a comma, and made of a distinctive pink granite that exists in very few other places on Earth. On that island stands the Garbo Island Lighthouse, and it is a genuinely remarkable structure. It was built between 1858 and 1862 from pink granite quarried directly out of the island itself. The granite is so hard and so difficult to work that the stonemasons who built the lighthouse were mostly Scottish, imported specifically because they had experience with similar stone back home. The result is a 47-metre tower, the second tallest lighthouse in Australia after Cape Wickham on King Island. Glowing pink in the morning light, visible from boats far out in Bass Strait. A focal plane 55 metres above sea level. 3 flashes every 20 seconds. Still operational today, more than 160 years after it was first lit. The reason the lighthouse exists is grim. In 1853, the wooden steamship Monumental City struck nearby Tullaberga Island in bad weather and went down. 37 people drowned. The Victorian colonial government, under pressure to prevent further losses on this particularly treacherous corner of coast, fast-tracked construction of a permanent pink granite tower, replacing an earlier inadequate wooden structure. And the granite quarry on the northern end of Garbo Island still shows the scars of where the stonemasons cut. The island itself is an astonishing place. It is home to one of the world's largest colonies of little penguins. At its documented peak, around 20,000 breeding pairs, though the number has declined in recent years. New Zealand fur seals haul out on the rocks. Whales pass during migration. There are fewer than a handful of permanent residents on the island, and visiting requires a small aircraft from Marimbula or a boat from Malakuta that frequently cancels due to weather, and yet you can stay there. The old assistant keeper's cottage has been restored and is available for booking through Parks Victoria. Up to 8 people can sleep in a 19th century pink granite cottage on a remote island listening to penguins and seals argue outside the window while the second tallest lighthouse in Australia sweeps its beam across Bass Strait overhead. And the number of Victorians who have done it is tiny. Number 4. The ship that isn't there. On the coast between Warrnambool and Port Fairy in the high sand dunes of Armstrong Bay, something extraordinary may or may not be buried. Nobody has seen it since the 1880s. Several hundred people have dedicated parts of their lives to finding it. The Victorian state government offered $250,000 for anyone who could locate it. The reward was never claimed. This is the Mahogany ship. The first documented sighting was in 1836. 3 whalers, survivors of a shipwreck themselves, were walking along the beach from Port Fairy back to civilization when they stumbled across the remains of a large timber vessel high in the dunes, well above the current high tide mark. The ship's timber was described as dark, very hard, and unfamiliar. Over the following decades, dozens of credible witnesses, settlers, surveyors, whalers, timber cutters, confirmed seeing the wreck at various points in the dunes. A bolt from it ended up in the Warrnambool Museum. Locals cut souvenir pieces off it. John Mason, one of the more authoritative eyewitnesses, suggested the timber looked like mahogany or cedar, although he later withdrew his identification. Then, sometime around the 1880s, the dunes shifted, as dunes do, and the ship disappeared completely. And here is what makes the mahogany ship one of the most tantalising unsolved mysteries in Australian history. The coast between Warrnambool and Port Fairy is a known wreck graveyard. An estimated 700 ships have been lost along the broader shipwreck coast, so a buried wreck is not in itself unusual. What's unusual is what the wreck might be. In 1977, historian Kenneth McIntyre published a book arguing that it was a Portuguese caravel from the lost Cristóvão de Mendonça expedition of 1521, a secret Portuguese voyage that mapped much of the Australian east coast decades before any official European discovery. If true, it would rewrite the accepted history of European contact with Australia. Is the theory correct? Probably not in the strict form McIntyre proposed. Most serious academic opinion now holds that the wreck, if it still exists, is more likely an early 19th century vessel built of Australian hardwood rather than a 1500s Portuguese caravel. But probably not is a long way from definitely not, and every few years someone announces a new theory, a new fragment of timber, a new satellite imagery anomaly in the dunes. A Portuguese festival is held in Warrnambool every 2 years to celebrate the connection. Teresa Coll de Alvarenga, the Consul General of Portugal, has personally travelled to the festival from Sydney. The ship itself, meanwhile, is still out there. Or it isn't, and nobody in Warrnambool has the slightest intention of giving up on it. Number 3. The desert is just inside the forest. At the very southernmost tip of mainland Australia, in Wilson's Promontory National Park, there is a secret that most visitors to the park never see. You drive down from Melbourne, it's about a 2.5-hour trip, and you pass through the Wilson's Prom Park Gate. You are now in a national park famous for temperate rainforest, granite tours, pristine beaches, and a healthy population of wombats who have lost all fear of humans. This is what Wilson's Prom is known for. What it is not known for is that about 300 metres from the park entrance, behind a modest campsite called Stockyards, there is an enormous desert. Not a metaphorical desert, a real one. The Big Drift is a vast, constantly shifting inland dune system with sand dunes up to 63 metres tall, extending over a significant portion of the western side of the peninsula. Walk out along the management track from the campsite for about 25 minutes, scramble up the final brutally steep slope of soft sand. Many people end up crawling, and you emerge onto something that looks like the Sahara, a wind-sculpted expanse of gold sand stretching to the horizon with no vegetation, no path, no visual reference points at all. At sunset, the entire thing turns rose gold. The wind constantly reshapes the surface, so your footprints are gone within hours. At night, because Wilson's Prom has essentially no light pollution for hundreds of kilometres in any direction, the sky above the Big Drift is one of the best dark sky sights in Victoria. The Milky Way, Jupiter, Saturn, all visible to the naked eye, reflected dimly off the pale sand. Here's the part that makes the Big Drift a genuine secret. Most Wilson's Prom visitors drive straight past the Stockyards turnoff on their way to Tidal River or Squeaky Beach. The dune system is not visible from the road. It is not on the standard tourist map. And the track to it is so understated that many Victorians who have been to Wilson's Prom a dozen times have still never seen a photograph of the dunes, let alone climbed them. You are in a national park. 90 minutes to the west is ocean. 30 minutes north, there is rainforest. And in the middle of this, incongruously, is a silent miniature Sahara that almost nobody knows is there. Number 2, the cave that predates life on land. 360 kilometres east of Melbourne, in the East Gippsland town of Buchan. The name comes from the Gunai-Kuanai word Bukan Mungi, meaning the place of rocks with holes in them. There is a limestone reserve that holds one of the most extensive cave systems in Victoria. The Royal Cave and the Fairy Cave at Buchan are guided tour caves, open daily with walkways and electric lighting, sitting at a steady 17 degrees year-round, regardless of what the weather is doing above ground. They contain calcite-rimmed pools so delicate they look like spiderwebs spun in stone, forests of stalactites and stalagmites, and sections where the roof drops so low you have to stoop. They are beautiful in the way all good limestone caves are beautiful. But here is what makes Buchan actually remarkable and why it's number 2. The limestone the caves are carved into was laid down roughly 380 million years ago during the Devonian period. At that time, Everything that is now East Gippsland was the floor of a warm, shallow, tropical sea. Coral reefs grew. Shellfish lived, died, and settled in layers on the seabed. Over millions of years, those layers compressed into the limestone that today forms the Buchan Caves, and the fossils of those original Devonian sea creatures are still embedded in the walls. You walk past 380 million-year-old brachiopods fossilized in the rock. You pass coral embedded in the ceiling above your head. The guides point to preserved shell beds in the walls of the Royal Cave Exit Tunnel, an artificial tunnel blasted in 1929, and you can see fragments of fossilized coral and brachiopods just sitting there, casually, as decorative features in a cave tour. The Gunai people used the Buchan area as a meeting place for at least 18,000 years, and there is evidence, burials, artifact scatters, ceremonial sites in the broader Buchan Valley, making it one of the oldest continuously occupied cave landscapes in southeastern Australia. Certain caves in the region, outside the reserve, contain Pleistocene-era burials. The Mula Mulung Gune Kuranai magical practitioners used caves nearby for training and ritual, working with crystals and ash powders. You don't need to fly to Europe to walk through cathedral-scale limestone carved by ancient underground rivers. You can drive 6 hours east of Melbourne, pay for a ticket, and walk through a system that was a coral reef when fish were just starting to experiment with having legs. Which brings us finally to number one. Number one. The first footprints on land. About 80 kilometres north of Malakuta, in one of the most remote and almost never visited national parks in the state of Victoria, there is a red sandstone gorge cut by a river called the Genoa. Coupra-Canberra National Park is genuinely wild. There are almost no tracks. The main road is a four-wheel drive only dirt trail called the WB Line. The park's wilderness core has no tracks at all. By design, it is one of the largest functionally untouched ecosystems in Victoria, and most of it cannot be reached without a helicopter or a multi-day bushwalk through thick, trackless, temperate rainforest. The only reliable way into the deep parts of the park is to land a helicopter somewhere on the Genoa River itself and wade upstream with your gear on your back, which is what research teams have been doing for decades. The reason they go is the rock. Sometime in the 1960s, a local amateur naturalist named Norman Wakefield was exploring the upper gorge of the Genoa River when he noticed something unusual in the red Devonian sandstone of the riverbed. It looked, he thought, like footprints. In 1971, the paleontologist James Warren formally examined the slab. In 1972, the discovery was published, and it rewrote a piece of the evolutionary history of the entire planet. The markings in the Genoa Gorge sandstone are fossilized tetrapod footprints, the tracks of one of the earliest four-legged animals to walk on dry land. They date to the late Devonian period, roughly 370 to 380 million years ago. At the time the animal that made these prints was alive, life on Earth was still overwhelmingly an aquatic phenomenon. Fish had just started experimenting with limb-like fins. Plants had only recently colonized the land in any serious way. And somewhere in what is now the Genoa River Gorge in East Gippsland, a small, four-limbed, lizard-like creature, something quite like Telurpidon, which was about the size of a large salamander, walked across wet mud, left a clear trackway, and then kept going. The mud dried. It turned to stone. The stone tilted, eroded, and eventually wound up on the bed of the Genoa River, where a local bushman found it in the 1960s and recognised that it was important. Only 3 or 4 sites on Earth contain confirmed Devonian tetrapod trackways: the Zakelmi Quarry in Poland, Valentia Island in Ireland, Tarbet Ness in Scotland, and the Genoa River in Victoria. It is one of the oldest records anywhere on Earth of a vertebrate walking on land. It is effectively a fossilised baby step in the evolutionary line that eventually led to every reptile, every bird, every mammal, and every human being currently watching this video. And it is sitting more or less in a riverbed in East Gippsland, in a national park that most Victorians have never heard of, accessed by a road most of them would refuse to drive. A small bronze memorial to the discovery stands near the Genoa River footbridge, with a life-size sculpture of the trackmaker and a cast of the footprints embedded in concrete at its base. That's it. That's the whole monument to the fact that the evolutionary ancestry of all land-dwelling vertebrate life on this planet has a documented checkpoint in a red sandstone gorge in remote Victoria. If you need a reason to feel very small and very young, a 380 million year old footprint in a riverbed nobody visits is a reasonable place to start. 12 places. Go find them. And if you make it to the Genoa, stand quietly in the gorge for a minute. You are visiting a relative. Cheers.